All right. Good Wednesday, October 29th, everyone. Welcome to episode 45 of PatristiCast. Today, I'm very happy to welcome a friend of mine as our guest today, Dr. Alex Fogleman, who's Associate Dean of Special Programs and Assistant Professor of Theology at Trinity Anglican Seminary just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he's here today to talk about his wonderful new book, Knowledge, Faith, and Early Christian Initiation. Dr. Fogleman, thank you very much for joining PatristiCast.
Oh, thanks, John. So good to be with you.
So, knowledge, faith, and early Christian initiation. All right. So Um, in this book, you focus particularly on Latin writers. So you don't really get into the Greek East at all. You stick with the Latins, and it's roughly kind of split into two time periods, say Tertullian in the second century to Cyprian of Carthage in the mid third century. And then the second part, kind of Ambrose of Milan to Augustine, essentially in the second half. Now, I thought maybe a good way to start this discussion is to start with a quote. Quote, "The formalization of baptismal instruction, what is often now referred to as the catechumenate," this is on page 2, by the way, if you have your book and you're following along, "was supremely important to early Christianity. Arguably the only educational institution unique to Christianity in its first 500 years. As a formal system for facilitating the process of membership and full initiation, the catechumenate played a major role in the solidification and spread of Christianity. But how should we understand the changing shape of catechesis in these years? How, in other words, do we get from Tertullian's warning, that is, Tertullian's warning that we should perhaps postpone initiation until the adult years, to Augustine's plea, which is let's get him in here as fast as possible? At issue in these questions are not simply differing views of baptism or pastoral tactics. We face here perennial Christian questions about the relationship between knowledge, faith, and learning. How does the Christian faith claim to offer true wisdom and virtue? What are the practices that lead to genuine knowledge of God, and how do they lead to spiritual transformation? If faith is a divine gift, can it be taught? Is there a rationale to learning what only comes by grace? Above all, what difference do Christian commitments to understanding Jesus Christ as both divine and human make for Christian modes of knowing?" End quote. Long quote, but I think a great one that orients the readers to what you're talking about in the book. This relationship between Christian initiation and also um, uh, development or acquisition of Christian knowledge. What's going on here in early Christian initiation and epistemology as you frame it?
Yeah, that's a great question and a good quote that does, I think, really get to um, what was kind of at the heart of the book. And admittedly, it was somewhat retrospective that some of that language came into being. So this was at a former time a doctoral dissertation that I did at Baylor University, and interested in more broadly the development of the catechumenate. It was something that I'd sort of been alerted to at some point through doctoral studies, and even before that, I was a student at Regent College, and there's talk about the sort of the recovery of catechesis in the church. Um, and I just wanted to simply do a more kind of deeper study. And well, what was the catechumenate in the early church? You hear lots of people making these claims
Mm-hmm.
about, the present day church being like the early church in different capacities, obviously different in many ways, but so some of the drive that I would see and more kind of like um, pastoral writing or theological writing about the nature of the church was a sort of retrieval of the early Christian catechumenate. And so I just thought, well, kind of borrowing some of the questions about what should we do now in our present day,
Mhm.
what was going on and how are they thinking about um, the catechumenate, this process of instructing and this kind of instruction that is geared around initiation, around
Mhm.
baptism. Just how are they thinking about this? But I was also thinking about these kinds of questions, not only sort of historically, sort of reconstructing the steps of initiation, which there's been lots of good work done
Mhm.
in just sort of liturgical history, sort of recovering what were the stages of initiation, what were the structures, and a more sort of historical account of the
Mhm.
catechumenate. I've always been interested in just kind of the theological questions
Mhm.
that are latent within these kinds of historical practices. And so that's sort of what what began this project, what sort of began this research was approaching the question of the catechumenate, but from with kind of theological questions about
Mhm.
the encounter with God. How do we know? What does it mean to know God?
Yeah.
We use this language, but what does it mean to know God in this context, and what are the kinds of ways of knowing that are inscribed in these practices of catechesis and initiation? So that was sort of driving the research, and it really was only after, it was one of those things you
Mhm.
see kind of more clearly in retrospect,
Mhm.
um, realizing that, oh, these are the fundamental questions
Yep.
um, about what it means to know God as a creature, as a finite creature. How does one know an infinite God? And if divine knowledge is something beyond human grasp, the human sort of capacity, um, then what is the role of other human beings, institutions
Mhm.
in forming and shaping knowledge? And then seeing that these are also questions that are not totally novel to early Christians, that these are questions that Plato's talking about.
Yep.
And so even seeing some of the connections between a kind of ancient discourse about what does it mean for a human being to encounter truth, and then what does that mean in a particularly Christian context where there are theological questions at this time emerging, Christological questions about God taking on human flesh. What does that mean for our the sort of practices of instructing others into a way of knowing God? If that kind of knowledge is not just to be a sort of now you know some more data points that you
Mhm.
didn't previously know.
Mhm.
So those are some of the kind of meta framework about thinking about where this project came from, but also the kinds of questions I was asking. It doesn't quite fit into like just a historical reconstruction of the catechumenate, but it's this sort of weird blend of me asking theological
Mhm.
questions about a
Mhm.
historical practice, I guess.
Well, on the one hand, I would think that that should be central to a project like this because these writers, they assumed that such theological questions were central to the process of initiation into the
Yeah,
church. This wasn't just you're becoming part of the group. Um, you are being initiated into the mysteries of the Christian religion. And what
that's
does
right.
that mean? What are those um, uh, theological and moral commitments that you are about to embark on
Yeah.
as you go through this process? Um, I'm glad you brought up Plato because you start by contextualizing the Christian catechumenate. There, we just read in that long quote, you call it unique to Christianity at the time, and yet you situate the catechumenate within the
Mhm.
broader context of Greco-Roman paideia, education. And you talk about you get into Christoph Markschi's wonderful book, Early
Mhm.
Christian Theology and Its Institutions. Talk a little bit about that. Where does the catechumenate, or where did the catechumenate fit in the broader landscape of ancient paideia?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And that was again something that was a little bit retrospective. It was um seeing these kind of through lines from the catechumenate into kind of ancient philosophy. And so wanting to just kind of trace those out in more detail. And um, I don't think I did this in any sort of like miraculous way. Um, I would have loved to spend more time looking at sort of ancient educational cultures.
Hmm.
I think those are really rich places to think about the catechumenate. Um, yeah, that in that line about the catechumenate being a sort of uniquely Christian educational institution is not original to me.
Hmm.
I think it's Gemeinhard who said
I
something
think
like that, or that like spurred, that it was a kind of line that I
Peter
think I,
Gemeinhardt, Peter
yeah,
Gemeinhardt, you're talking about over in
that's
Germany
right.
right now. Yep, yep.
Yep. I hope I cite him in the book.
I think you did. I think you did.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So that was that line just always kind of stuck with me. So there's a novelty to this institution and its sort of formalization, especially by the fourth century. Um, but then it's not a so I think what I would say is it's a new educational institution within the ancient world,
Hmm.
but it doesn't originate, purely ex nihilo. So what are the sort of educational institutions that provide some of the background, some of the material out of which the patristic catechumenate is constructed?
Hmm.
And so, I mean, broadly speaking, I was inclined. I did more with sort of mystery religion stuff in the
Yeah.
doctoral dissertation. Not a lot of that made it into the book form. I focused more in the sort of philosophical contexts of the early Christian catechumenate. And there, I was so struck by, yes, some of the larger questions I alluded to earlier, kind of Plato in the Socratic world against the sophists,
Hmm.
thinking about does human language actually have any purchase with spiritual divine realities, that those sort of broader questions. But then I was looking into some of the first, second, third century Epicurean and Stoic
Hmm.
philosophical context and I mean, the sort of most clear connection is kind of like this is where some of the canon of truth language
Hmm.
emerges that we'll see people like Irenaeus and Tertullian using. Um, and on the surface, like they're using the kind of language in an apparently different way. Like what they mean by
Hmm.
canon of truth is not what Irenaeus means by canon of truth. But in a pedagogical sense, um, there is. I was struck more by the parallels between their uses of canon of truth language as a way of saying, here are the givens of reality, here are the given things, and then a rule of faith is that which can help you proceed into truth. It can help you
Hmm.
grow into truth and without which you sort of uh, go into an infinite regress where you're never able to have a sort of real grounding. You're never able to get off the ground if you don't have a rule of truth. So I saw at the pedagogical level this canon regular language functioning in a similar way as it does in Stoic and Epicurean contexts, notwithstanding much larger differences.
Hmm.
Um, and then the other piece that I've always been struck by is the focus on memory in
Hmm.
these contexts, especially when you're talking about the instruction of new initiates. And so providing kind of things, providing a discourse, providing summations of a teacher's writing. You see a lot of these in kind of Pythagorean philosophical contexts. But this emphasis on developing these epitomes uh, of someone's writing, or or things that can be easily memorized. And then that also similarly gives you a grounding. It gives you a base from which then you can then proceed in the exercise of coming into knowledge of truth.
Right.
So I focus mostly in kind of, in this language emerges a lot in kind of Epicurean and Stoic sources, emphasis on regula and emphasis on memory.
Mm,
And then, so looking at the sort of pedagogically, what are the sort of shared similarities there?
mm.
And then the last thing I'll say on that is another sort of like just curiosity that I'm still wondering about is, and I can't remember where I came across this, but it was one of these passages looking at particularly Epicurean um, claims about memory and regular language, and then also making the connection, well, when you're doing this kind of like pedagogical work for kind of cultural minorities and the sort of cultural outcasts. The Epicureans are the sort of outcast here. They're also the ones that are more likely to be teaching women and children.
Mm-hmm.
Which, so again, you see some of these parallels with Christianity at the sociological level.
Yep. Yep.
Like who are the people that are teaching slaves and Christian and women and children? They're using some of the same tactics as other sort of despised philosophical group. So while they're teaching very different things, obviously, and Christianity, I think, is actually, I think one could argue that Christianity is trying to especially distinguish itself from Epicureans who are accused of being atheists, just like
Yep.
Christians are.
Yep.
Right. It's
Yep.
similar. So you see, I think my hunch is you see similar accusations cast at Epicureans and Christians, both at the sociological and the sort of theological level. And then Christians are responding to that in ways that I think are really interesting. So that's more speculative, kind of like pet. That's at the pet theory level of like how I view some of these sources. But nonetheless, I think it's well worth considering.
I think it is, and it's so you talk about the regula, the rule of truth, or sometimes it'll be referred to as the rule of faith. This is that um, the core principles of Christian teaching that later kind of develop. They're like precursors to the creed, really, in a crude way of putting it. But there's also with the regula or the canon, also a canon of texts or literature. So the Epicureans, for them, as they're being brought into the community, they're being trained in the writings of their founder, Epicurus, and maybe Philodemus too, who's a pretty big figure in the
Mhm.
Epicureans. Um, Stoics, they're probably getting a good education in Zeno and Chrysippus,
Yeah.
um, Epictetus. The Aristotelians, you have Alexander of Aphrodisias writing commentaries on Aristotle, perhaps as part of the Aristotelian education curriculum. And Christianity, we get, the canon are these religious texts that they have, what we call the
Mhm.
Old and New Testaments. And I remember the first paper I published was on Origin in the homilies on the Psalms. And this is relevant for what you talk about memory.
Hmm.
Um, so Brian Stock has this notion of textual communities
Yes.
where
Mhm.
you have like a text that's being delivered to the audience, and then the second stage is like the instruction. It's been a long time now. If I could write this essay, I would do it over again and do it differently. But the second is like you have people who are trained to kind of explain and help the
Mm,
audience understand the text. And then the third, he calls this historicization of the community, where the community kind of takes on a historical identity uh, in relation to the text. And that's what Origen does in these homilies.
Hmm.
He talks at great length about the Israelites and their journey through the desert during the Exodus. And he keeps on applying it like this is you. This is
Yes.
written for you, for us who have died with Christ and risen again with him. So there's a sense of baptism. You're taking on this new identity and you're being formed with this new kind of cultural memory that's linked with the kind of the journey of the Israelites and their story of their relation with God. So the memory part, I think, is central, and I was so glad
Hmm.
you dealt with that in your book, not with Origen, of course, but with these Latin writers, because I think it's central. Um, to what it is to be initiated into Christianity. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, they're giving new Christians a sense of what we would call a new identity, but
mhm,
a new identity through belonging to this people and to this
mhm.
story. This is the way that some people have written about Irenaeus's demonstration of the apostolic preaching
Yes,
as
right.
a kind
That's
of
right.
text in which he lays out the sort of parameters of the rule of faith in the opening chapters, but the bulk of the work is sort of articulating this. This is the story of Scripture told Christologically,
Hmm.
um, and that's the story that you're being brought into. And then you see Augustine doing something very similar in De Catechizandis Rudibus, when he's talking about what's the first thing you say? This is not even like catechesis proper, as in once someone's already become a catechumen. This is like what you say to somebody on the cusp of becoming a
Hmm.
catechumen. You tell the story of Scripture, with the central focus on God's love for people in Christ. Like it's this
Hmm.
very like there's a narratival aspect to it, but the purpose of that is really inscribing people into this sort of memory of the church, this sort of
Right.
larger memory.
Right. Right.
And Origen's really interesting. He's one of the only ones I know of that does his reading of the reading of the wilderness wandering. He I don't think he does it systematically. You would know better than I do, but do it systematically. But at least on one or two occasions, compares the catechumenate with the wilderness wandering, and
Hmm.
so that the crossing of the Red Sea is not
Yep.
baptism, but the initiation of the catechumenate is the crossing of the Jordan into the promised land. That's the baptismal
Yeah.
image, and this
Yep.
this sort of mapping, again, bringing their lives into this is who you are,
Hmm.
as part of God's people, and this is your
Yeah.
season of life too. Like
Hmm.
this is not the promised land, this is the wilderness wandering.
This is
And
the
so
training ground. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. So this is
Yeah.
the sort of preparation for baptismal life.
I
uh,
think he makes that distinction between crossing the Red Sea and crossing the Jordan in his homilies on Joshua. I think
okay,
that's where
yeah,
that is.
that
I
sounds
think.
right.
Don't quote me, but I think that's where it is.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. He has this fascinating little treatise, Peri Pascha, on the
Hmm.
Passover. And Harold Buchinger, another German, like Gemeinhardt, um, says he thinks there's evidence in there for the Easter baptismal initiation rite
Mm.
in Origen's exegesis, because that treatise is an exegesis of Exodus 12, 1 to 12, I think are the verses where
Hmm.
the Exodus is being narrated. And it's, today will be the beginning of months for you. And Origen's, well, what is this beginning? Well, you're taking on this new way of life. And what is that? You're purifying yourself. Um, and I forget. So that part is the washing of regeneration, baptism.
Hmm.
When they smear the blood of the sacrificial lambs on their doorposts, that's chrismation. That's where you're putting the seal of your faith of Christ on. And then, when you eat the Paschal Lamb, that's both Eucharist, but he spends more time talking about that's how we chew on the mystical meanings of the
Mm,
scriptures, you know. So
yeah.
it's quite fascinating.
Yeah.
But this book isn't about Origen. This book is about Latin. So let's get into you talked about you talked about Irenaeus, okay? And here's your title for the chapter on Irenaeus: Knowledge of the Real. Irenaeus of Lyon and Aesthetic Knowing. Tell us about Irenaeus and uh, his epistemology and its relation to the catechumenate.
Yeah. So I tried to give each of the titles of the chapter a little clever sort of ways to sort of pull out something distinctive about each of their approaches to epistemology. So with Tertullian, I focused on sort of simplicity, how he
Hmm.
develops a sort of rhetoric of simplicity. With the Hippolytan school's writing, focus on a language of mystery. Um, with Irenaeus, I kept being drawn to this the category of aesthetics. And again, not not the first to recognize this by any means. Um, this is something that you find in Irenaeus scholars, but his attention to again what has been presented, what has been given in sort of historical, sensory, corporeal ways. So what are the things that we've been given? And again, he's contrasting this with a kind of Valentinian esotericism that's attentive to the hidden, the other, the sort of the not the mysterious, but the sort of the arcane.
Hmm.
And so what Irenaeus is trying to get at in several ways is a sort of how do we see in what has been given the means by which we can encounter the invisible.
Hmm.
Um, so even in the way that he talks about the rule of faith in the demonstration, he said, why are we baptized into these three heads, these three Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Well, it's like, well, the Spirit sort of presents us to Christ, and Christ as the image of the invisible God uh, presents us to the Father. So it's this, I was struck by the sort of metaphors, the sort of language that they're using to describe what's happening in a sort of Trinitarian baptismal initiation. We are being drawn through the sort of aesthetic engagement, through the sensory, through the corporeal, to that which is beyond the sensory. Um, And so at the same time, he's sort of contrasting this Valentinian sort of arcane hiddenness. He's he's encouraging to think that this is the to see to and then through that to trust in the created world as a reliable means by which God is given to help us encounter the living word. And so whereas again, so seeing on the one hand, you can just kind of read this as a polemical. He's doing just
Hmm.
whatever the
Yeah.
Valentinians are not doing. Yeah.
Yeah. Do the opposite. Yep.
Yeah, take that and do the opposite. But when you act, then when you see what he's doing, it's not that's not the sole sort of governing factor in what Irenaeus is doing. Um, yeah, but he is drawing on these sort of aesthetic principles. So. Yeah, again, I was just really struck by the different metaphors that he uses to talk about how we come to know God, things that he does in those early books of Against Heresies. So contrasting, the Valentinian use of scripture, the Homeric cantos,
Hmm.
to the famous image of Christ as the king rather than the fox, right? He keeps appealing to these sorts of images as a way to say that and by the way, the Valentinians don't only recreate the mosaic into the image of a fox, they do a pretty lousy job at it too.
Yeah.
They can't help but like
Yeah.
take a few digs
Yeah.
at their the poor manner of their rearrangement. So that's just it's a long way of saying that what I found so fascinating in Irenaeus's approach to catechesis, this sort of epistemology, is that yes, he's teaching, or possibly something like the rule of faith in baptism. He's got sort of polemical opponents, and he's trying to sort of guard against heretical uses of scripture and all of that. But I try to look a little more deeply at like, well, what is the sort of pedagogy of knowing God
Hmm.
that's implied in this approach? And I kept coming to this sort of like he's articulating a way in which Christians can inhabit the world, the world, the created world, as the place in which a good creator has made for them to know God
Hmm.
in that particular context, rather than the aborted world of the demiurge, that sort of
Right,
thing.
right. That's it's an interesting dichotomy. Now, I'm sure there are some people who, have really gone into great detail with the Valentinian texts, whatever remains of them.
Hmm.
But really, the standard of what we would kind of consider the Orthodox church fathers would have seen in Valentinians, these Gnostics, um, an unacceptable form of dualism
Hmm.
where
Yeah.
you know where like material things are, if they're not objectively evil in themselves, they're somehow uh distractions, and
Yeah.
we need to get beyond them to these mysteries. But Irenaeus is responding against it, as you say, and I want, does he get into um like the particularity of the sacraments in this discussion? Because it
Mm.
would seem like it would be pretty important to talk. These are the things, for our sacraments, we rely on things that are, as you say,
Yeah.
given to us. This is what we
Yeah.
have. Does he get
Yeah.
into that?
Yeah, he does it. I know he deals somewhat with Eucharistic theology at various points. I looked more at what he said about baptism.
Hmm.
Uh, and he does do this. Actually, now I can't remember if I put this in the chapter or not, but there's some point where he'll lay out, here's the sort of five sort of Valentinian, types of baptism. Um, And there's only one of those that like just flatly rejects the use of water
Hmm.
in the sacrament. And it's like a
Hmm.
purely spiritual kind of baptism. The other four
Hmm.
like use some configuration of that. And he, of course, in his nice way, polemical way, says, really, this is like the true Valentinian theology. He's like,
Hmm.
yeah, sociologically, there's several different kinds of practices, but this fourth one that actually does reject water is really like the
That
true
that's
essence
the
of
authentic
Valentinian
Valentinian baptism.
baptismal
Yeah.
theology. And it is this kind of like because it's sort of consistent with its theology of 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 the rejection of the created world.
Yeah.
And again, as you probably as you kind of alluded to, there's plenty of people that would just say that's completely unfair reading of these
Yeah.
Valentinian texts, and they don't mean to reject the created world and so forth and so
But but
on.
I but I think we should take serious, because I think a lot of those people just dismiss Irenaeus as just
Yeah,
being purely polemical.
that's
Whereas
right.
I think it'd be fair to Irenaeus to say that's actually what he thought they were doing.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
he's not
Yeah.
making it up. He could
He's
be
not
right, or
making
he,
it
he
up, and
could be
he is
wrong.
trying to discern the kind of like theological substructure. He's
Mhm.
like, I see what they're saying and I see what they're doing, but here's what I see them actually doing.
Yeah, right, right. That's
Yeah.
right. So this gets us into the question of, how do we engage the material world that's been given to us? This is what we have from this creator who's
Mhm.
good. Um, how do we perceive in that accurately the nature of the divine, a concept
Yeah.
of God, worthy of God, without falling into the trap of kind of worshiping nature as a kind of form of God? It's
Yeah.
like a pantheism.
Yeah.
And your chapter on Ambrose of Milan
Hmm.
talks about training the senses. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, It would seem to me that Ambrose has a very similar concern to that of Irenaeus.
Yeah.
In yeah, we have these things, but they're good, but let's not mistake them for something that they are not.
Yes. Yeah.
What are these spiritual senses?
That's right. Yeah. So with the chapter on Ambrose, I picked up on the sort of discourse of the spiritual senses, and again, this is something that we all owe to Origen in
Mm,
its more refined form. And so I see Ambrose very much doing something similar to that, or taking up that tradition of the spiritual senses very well. And I saw this especially clearly in some of his catechetical writings. So there's some debate on whether his sermons on the patriarchs are catechetical texts. He makes a reference in the text De Mysteries that
mm,
you've heard we've given you thus far. He's talking to the newly initiated as the audience of De Mysteries. He says we've given you a sermon on the patriarchs and Proverbs.
mm,
So this kind of like narratival, we've given you stories, the stories of the patriarchs, but also this kind of like, um, you know, moral wisdom
mhm,
in proverbial literature. Um, so this is the way you've been formed thus far. You've been taught the morals of the faith, as in you've been taught what it means to live as a Christian. And that sort of moral training is not simply it's not really prerequisite for salvation in the way that like a Protestant would kind of worry about.
mhm.
Um, the way that they're talking about sort of moral preparation is this is sort of capacitating your spiritual senses in
Yes.
order to be capable of seeing and encountering divine reality. So that language of training the spiritual senses is something I think you see Ambrose doing, not just in the sort of what when he's talking to the newly initiated. He has these two wonderful texts, De Sacramentis and De Mysteris, and they're explications of the sacraments for the newly initiated. This sort of like unspoken rule of the
Mm,
day, the discipline of secrecy, the discipline of arcani, is that you don't tell the non-initiated about the sacraments. So you're now, but now is the time. Now that they've been initiated, it's the Easter octave, and now is the
mm.
time of this process that's often referred to as mystagogy in the literature,
Yep.
the sort of leading into the mysteries. Now is the time for telling them what happened. And so you see Ambrose doing this sort of live. This is like you walked into the baptismal font. You unrobed, you stepped down into the font. Um, and he talks about there that talks about what you couldn't perceive. Before that you would have just seen water.
Mhm,
Now you see the power of the gospel.
mhm,
This kind of language. You
mhm.
see water washing away your sin. That sort of language. So he talks about this kind of like mostly visual. I'm sure you could do more with like the other spiritual senses. So I mainly was looking towards more at the visual, like how is he talking about their encounter with sort of spiritual reality in this sort of sacramental realities. But I see this as very much sort of in line with what Irenaeus and Tertullian are doing, um, and others about, yes, you are instructing them in basic sort of Christological doctrine, Trinitarian theology, like there's one God, the Word became flesh. You're teaching them sort of what we would call this the basic elements of the rule of faith.
Mhm,
But as you're doing that, and the way that you're doing that is also helping new Christians inhabit the world Christianly. Like
mhm,
you're sort of um, inviting them and training them to see all of creation through the sort of lens of these sacramental
mhm,
realities. And so again, it's that language of like how we engage the created world. What's our um, sort of how do we view created
mhm.
realities, and their capacity to draw us into the divine life.
Yeah, it's interesting how things can really connect because a couple of episodes ago, I had Doru Kostake on, and we
Hmm.
talked about
Yeah.
Clement of Alexandria and his uh, how, like how he understood physics and the
Hmm.
purpose of physics
Yeah.
in paideia and education.
Hmm.
And there's that classical threefold structure of ethics, physics, and then epoptics or like mystical contemplation. It's
Yeah.
because they understood this intrinsic relationship between moral formation and training of the mind.
Hmm.
And what you just described sounds like Ambrose is working within that tradition. So
Yeah.
this ethical formation isn't just about acquiring virtue for the sake of virtue. It's not a works righteousness.
Yeah.
Um, Although, to be fair, uh, I think they would probably put more emphasis on works than
Yeah.
Luther would.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. I'm just
Yeah.
just saying.
Yeah.
Um, but they understood that this ethical formation
Yeah.
was meant to like cleanse the soul of these passions, these kind
Hmm.
of disordered affections which prevent the spiritual senses from functioning properly. Would
Yeah.
you say that kind of Ambrose is working within that framework?
Absolutely. And I've wondered, and I just wonder if this is just lost to us or if this is not there, but what Origen does with the sort of threefold, like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs,
Yep.
is
Yep.
mapping onto ethics, physics, and eptoptics.
Mhm.
Is those that sort of trifold way. I would wonder if we would actually see some of that in early Christian literature. You do see um, there's a treatise ascribed to Hippolytus on the Song of Songs.
Mhm.
One of one of the few things we have on this in this period on that. And this is best, I think, best seen. It's a difficult manuscript,
Yep.
blah blah
Yep.
blah. But
Yep.
I think at its best, it seems most likely to be a kind of Easter, kind of a almost a
Mhm.
Pascha kind of.
Oh.
This is a
Oh.
way of reading Song of Songs as you're now being welcomed and you're now entering the Holy of Holies. It's kind of Easter sermon notes or something like that.
Mhm.
So no, it's again kind of just purely speculative and somebody kind of above my pay grade that would
Mhm.
could do more of that kind of probably at the manuscript kind of level research on saying, do we see any of um,
I think we
that kind
do
of Proverbs,
actually.
Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs mapping onto
Mm.
are those texts at all being used in catechetical initiation?
I don't know if they're used in catechetical initiation, but I think with Didymus the Blind, we see that kind of framework put to the interpretation of these texts. Because uh, I don't know what we have from him on Proverbs. I think we've got some small fragments that
Hmm.
appear to be ethically oriented. We do have his lectures on Ecclesiastes, which
Right.
seem
Yeah.
to be really getting into physics or like natural philosophy. We don't
Hmm.
have Song of Songs stuff from him.
Yeah.
But I think some have argued that Didymus the Blind actually did apply that threefold structure to
Interesting.
his
Yeah.
interpretation of these wisdom books.
Yeah. And then I think of Gregory of Nyssa as someone who also has homilies on Ecclesiastes and Song of
Yes,
Songs.
yes,
But
yes.
yeah, I'm curious now as to if we have any stuff on Proverbs, fragments or whatever.
Worth looking into for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. But I've
Um,
always been, yeah, again, one of those sort of like ways in which early Christians are appropriating philosophical pedagogy into their sort of structures of teaching. I think
mhm.
that threefold pattern there is really illuminating to as a lens for understanding how early Christians are instructing believers on into knowledge of God.
I think we got time for maybe one more question. I think this question will probably take up a good 10, 15 minutes. Um, so at the very beginning, I hinted at in the very beginning of your book, you draw you draw a contrast. You got Tertullian, uh, late second century, maybe early third. um, saying, we should maybe push off initiation until somebody's had a real chance to work through it, and to chew on it. And then you got Augustine, let's get him in there.
Yeah.
Um, Now, something very important happens in between Tertullian and Augustine, who's, at the turn of the 400s. And that's this Emperor Constantine, and kind of the so-called kind of legalization of Christianity in the empire. What
Mhm.
how could you talk about the impact of that shift in Christianity? What do we see different about the catechumenate post-Constantine versus pre-Constantine?
Yeah. Yeah, this is again a sort of subtext of the whole book and something that's is more kind of more part of the dissertation work was sort of looking at the effects of the, whatever you want to call it, the Constantinian turn in the
Hmm.
fourth century. What are the effects of that on catechesis? Um, and um, and there is a pretty strong sort of, or what I thought to be a pretty strong Constantinian reading of patristic catechesis in
Hmm.
the sort of scholarship on this topic. So when I first came to it, it was reading a lot of like more of a contrastive approach to pre and post Constantinian catechesis in that the sort of oversimplified narrative would be something like before Constantine, the church is a scrappy minority subculture, and its catechumenate is lengthy, it's robust, and it's moral. There's a lot of like deeply biblical and kind of moral formation that's happening in the pre-Constantinian period. And you can say, oh, it's like a 2 to 3 year initiate boot camp, because hey, it's dangerous to be a Christian.
Hmm.
You can be martyred. You need to prepare for that. Well, after Constantine, what happens? Well, you go from Christianity being sort of social minority to now being the accepted and even preferred religion of the empire, and now suddenly you have all these elites that want to become Christians, and they're sort of flocking to the
Hmm.
church now and
Hmm.
wanting to clamoring for
Hmm.
position. And so gradually those high bars of entry become softened and softened to
Yeah.
where you go from a 3 year catechumenate to now catechesis is just a 40-day Lenten period. And honestly, what kind of moral formation can possibly happen in that period? So and then you see also, so it goes from being sort of rigorous to lax, and then moral to, to sacramental. So
Hmm.
this sort of in the
Hmm.
contrastive narrative, you would see this sort of like um, now that the pagan mysteries have been squashed, where we can reappropriate mystery language to sort of capture the allure that was once just sort of naturally inscribed in early Christian initiation, pre-Constantinian initiation. So again, in like big broad brush strokes, that was the sort of like narrative that I kept seeing in sort of histories of the patristic catechumenate. Some of those written like deliberately from a kind of Anabaptist
Hmm.
perspective, or like written by Anabaptist scholars, or like that was a sort of like generating this, but not everywhere. You'd find that across sort of denominational sort of
Hmm.
histories. Um, and so again, just the way I've been setting up is you can see where my sort of intervention in this is going as a way of seeing that just didn't map on to what I saw these figures actually doing.
Hmm.
So that works as a historical narrative, and there's contemporary applications of that sort of Constantinian narrative that I think some historians would try to draw.
Hmm.
Um, but what I saw was both on the was just like that doesn't seem to be mapping on. Like what I see Irenaeus doing, um, he's not presenting the faith in that kind of language. Like the kinds of thing Irenaeus is doing is similar to what Augustine is doing. And then
Mm,
so even when I looked at the kind of the biggest sort of like proof text of this is Tertullian's claim, and he makes this kind of similar rhetorical move in a handful of places. But his treatise on baptism is probably the most sort of oft-cited passage of this. You should not rush people to baptism. You should wait till they're mature. They're raised up. They know what they're getting into.
mhm.
Um, so I thought I would look at that as a particular instance of is this what Tertullian's doing? Like, does this make sense of the sort of like the Constantinian narrative? And again, just kind of looking at it um, through a different lens, kind of setting that aside. Like, what if the Constantinian narrative is not the sort of predominant lens for reading his material? Like, what would you say he's doing? And I would argue, and what I argue in the book is that what he's doing there fits into this more of distinguishing Christianity against um, perceived perceptions of Christianity as a upstart kind of mystery religion.
Mhm.
And so what you see Augustine or what you see Tertullian doing in these instances is I think I'd say something like he's presenting Christianity as true paideia. Um, what you're so it's more of an apologetic
Yeah.
way of presenting Christianity is this is Christianity. It's distinct from Valentinianism, which has so he'll on the one hand he will say that in the Prescription on Heretics, Tertullian will say um, in these heretical groups, there's no difference between a catechumen and a priest. My goodness, they'll teach the Lord's Prayer to the non-baptized. I mean, they'll just, there's no structure, there's no order, there's no paideia,
Mhm.
is the sort of what he's saying there. And then there's no catechumenate, right?
Right.
There's no
It's
process.
freewheeling.
Freewheeling. Then he'll turn right around, different context, in his against the Valentinians. And the very first thing he says about the Valentinians is they have this 5-year initiation process, but it's all secrecy, it's all mystery, and they're all just playing with your emotions. It's not actually substantive doctrine. There's no truth behind it. They're just manipulating you and tricking you, this sort of thing. So it was not about the time of the catechumenate. It's about the sort of paideia. It's about the sort of this is the sort of formation of a complete human person. Like this is the purpose of this is what Christianity is about. This is what true Christianity is about, as distinct from these other kinds of adjacent things that you might think we are, but we're different than those.
Mm.
So I see Tertullian in those most sort of like austere moments of presenting the catechumenate as this lengthy process of actually this part of this apologetic process of presenting Christianity as authentic paideia and positioning Christianity thus as a sort of on the same playing field as your sort of the best philosophical discourses and to be
Mhm.
considered as such and taken seriously as such.
Mhm.
Um, and then and there's been more scholarship on this, but when you see somebody like Augustine, um, saying, "Everybody, come on in, come on in,
Yeah, yeah,
come run to the font of grace." Um, so a couple of others of scholars have written more on this, critiquing this sort of like post-Constantinian, and they're saying that most of those sorts of admonitions come within particular liturgical seasons where it's appropriate to be sort of inviting people to sign up for baptism, basically.
yeah. Mhm.
So it's just, again, it's taking it a little bit out of the sort of macro, like here's this macro narrative about the Constantinian thesis and how it's sort of shaping our reading of particular Christian texts. And so setting that aside, looking at the text more closely and saying, well, what's actually happening in these texts? And is there a better way of narrating the sort of development of the catechumenate in the early church? And so that was my little intervention in
I
the
mean,
sort of scholarship on this stuff.
it seems to me that th that hermeneutic that you're kind of critiquing here is very consistent, with the broader view, which sees Constantine as either a hero or a villain.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
usually that's very strong in some people. Either he was
yeah,
a immaculate saint to, champion the church, or, he's this evil villain who brought the church to
yeah.
ruins and corruption. Whereas usually, oftentimes, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, the good
Or
both
it just
and.
kind of like puts it in its own place. So
Mhm.
it's not to say that Constantine has no effect on things. It's not to say that there
Mhm.
aren't changes
Right.
in early Christian catechesis during this period. It's just to say that the sort of Constantinian narrative is not the primary, certainly not the
Mhm.
sole narrative, like governing narrative of
Mhm.
this history.
Mhm.
But it's probably not even the main one. Is that you have things sort of internal to the Christian life, Christian faith, that are generating these sorts of practices.
Right. Well, what a wonderful kind of introduction to early Christian initiation in the Latin West, and the importance of paideia, or education, formation, however you want to translate that word, during this period. Dr. Fogleman, thank you very much. Go out and get yourselves a copy of his wonderful book, Knowledge, Faith, and Early Christian Initiation. Dr. Fogleman, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John. So much fun.
Yeah, you bet. Until next time, I will see you all later.